The sensor array had been tracking them for 6 days. 17 vessels, human configuration, mixed composition, frigates, destroyers, one cruiser designated UEF 774 registry out of the Arcturus forward station. They drifted through Kepler-7's neutral corridor in patterns that defied every principle of coordinated military movement. No coherent formation, no unified axis. Ships broke away from each other without warning and rejoined without reason, their trajectories tracing shapes that looked less like military doctrine and more like the random walk of leaves caught in a slow wind. Commander Draven Korath had been watching them for exactly 40 minutes before he allowed himself to speak. Analysis, he said. The word landed in the bridge of the ISV Sovereign's ruin, the way all of Korath's words landed without weight, without urgency, with the flatness of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. 31 years of Krathian Imperial Fleet service, 300 engagements across 9 contested sectors, not a single loss recorded in his operational file. The number sat somewhere between legend and statistic, depending on who was doing the counting. Tactical Officer Zarn moved to the central display without being asked twice. He was 40 years old, experienced enough to be competent, and young enough to still care what the numbers meant. His scales shifted through professional gray, the color of concentration of a mine working through data at speed. 17 vessels confirmed, Zarn said. Mixed composition, 6 frigates, 8 destroyers, 3 cruisers. UEF registry, markings on all visible hulls. They've been conducting active operations in the neutral corridor for 144 hours. He paused briefly. Tier 4 classification. Standard armament profile. Computational systems rated below Imperial standard by approximately 40%. Korath didn't look at Zarn, he looked at the display. The holographic projection showed the human fleet in real-time positions updated every 3 seconds by the Sovereign's Ruins primary sensor array. He watched one frigate brake hard to the left for no discernible tactical reason, watched a destroyer accelerate toward empty space, then reduce thrust without completing any maneuver that made sense, watched the distant cruiser drift perpendicular to the main body of the group as if its navigation system had simply given up. They've been doing this for 6 days, Korath said. Yes, Commander? And in 6 days, not one vessel has crossed into disputed territory. Zarn hesitated. Correct. Not by a single navigational unit. Korath finally turned away from the display. He was 54 years old, tall, even by Krathian standards, with the kind of face that had been weathered by service rather than age, not lined by time, but carved by decision. His scales sat in the deep amber of composed authority. He had worn that color for so long, it had stopped being a choice. He crossed to the observation window and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out into the pale blue light of the Kepler system star. The neutral zone extended 300,000 kilometers in every direction from his current position. Out there beyond the range of comfortable visibility, but well within sensor range, the human ships continued their incomprehensible drift. What does our intelligence assessment tell us about human military exercises, he asked. Comms Officer Lice pulled the file without hesitation. She was 35 efficient, the kind of officer who kept her scales at careful neutral, regardless of what the data said. Human civilization achieved standard interstellar capability approximately 200 standard years ago, Commander. Military doctrine is decentralized, multiple independent command structures operating without unified strategic oversight. Tactical methodology varies significantly by regional command, suggesting the absence of a coherent central doctrine. Technology assessment places them at Tier 4 with particular deficiencies in computational integration and sensor resolution. Tier 4, Korath said. Yes, Commander? He said nothing else. Tier 4 meant certain things in the language of galactic military assessment. It meant vessels that could travel faster than light, but couldn't consistently predict where they would arrive. It meant weapons capable of impressive damage at short range and unreliable targeting beyond it. It meant the kind of civilization that had stumbled into interstellar space before it had finished learning how to survive in it. The Krathian Empire had been Tier 2 for 800 years. Before that, for 3,000 years, they had occupied Tier 3, methodically building the infrastructure and doctrine and accumulated battlefield knowledge that had made their fleet the most respected military force in the assessed galaxy. Tier 4, Korath returned to the display. The human ships continued their purposeless motion. He watched for 30 more seconds, and then, almost against his will, a clicking sound escaped the back of his throat, the Krathian expression of contemptuous amusement. Sensor Officer Tiva, stationed at the far end of the bridge, looked up briefly. She was 38, precise the quietest officer on his crew. She said nothing, But Korath noticed that her hands had not returned to her console. He made a note of that. In 31 years of command, he had learned that silence from a competent officer was more informative than anything they said aloud. Maintain observation, he said. Plot intercept vectors at standard patrol intervals. I want to be in position to respond if any vessel crosses into disputed space. Understood, Commander. And inform the escort fleet to maintain formation Delta 4. I have no intention of violating the treaty, but I have every intention of being ready. The bridge returned to its practiced rhythm. Officers moved between stations with the precision that 4,000 years of Krathian military culture had refined into something approaching art. No wasted motion, no unnecessary communication. Every action anticipated, categorized, and completed within the parameters of doctrine that had been tested across more battlefields than any living Krathian could personally recall. This was what 3 centuries of continuous victory looked like from the inside. Not dramatic, not loud, just precise, relentless, and utterly certain of itself. Korath settled into his command throne and continued watching the humans drift. He was still watching 40 minutes later when Zarn spoke again, and this time the quality of his voice was different, not alarm because Zarn was too disciplined for alarm, but something quieter. Something that sat between professional observation and personal uncertainty. Commander, I've been running continuous analysis on the human formation pattern. Speak. Their individual movements are irregular, unpredictable by any standard tactical model, but when I assess the timing of those movements collectively, Zarn paused in a way that was for him unusual. The synchronization between vessels is precise to the microsecond, Commander. Every apparent deviation from logic happens at intervals that are statistically non-random. The bridge was very quiet. You're saying their chaos is timed, Korath said. I'm saying the timing of their case is consistent across 17 vessels simultaneously, which is either an extraordinary coincidence or their automated systems are compensating for tactical deficiency, Korath interrupted. Proximity protocols maintaining spacing. The ships aren't coordinating. They're simply not colliding. Zarn was quiet for 2 seconds. That is a possible explanation, Commander. It was the most careful way he knew how to say it was not the explanation he found most convincing. Korath looked at him. Log it, he said. Continue observation. Yes, Commander. Tiva still had not fully returned her attention to her console. Korath noted that as well, and filed it under the growing category of small things that did not yet add up to anything definitive and might add up to something important later. The message from the single stationary vessel arrived at standard communications frequency at exactly 0847 ship time. It was not a distress signal, not a request for navigation assistance, a standard identification transmission, the kind exchanged between vessels entering shared space, brief, precise, containing exactly the information required by treaty protocol. No more, no less. Liss relayed the translation without commentary. UEF vessel designation, Resolute Registry, Arcturus Forward Station, Commander Seraphine Voss, commanding conducting authorized military exercises in neutral space per Treaty of Galactic Concordance, Section 3, Subsection 8. Transmission ends. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. That's it, said Reich. He was 24, the youngest officer on Korath's bridge, and had not yet learned that questions which revealed surprise were better kept internal. Korath made a mental note to address that, then made a second note that the young ensign had been the first person on the bridge to speak, which was more interesting than the remark itself. That's it, Liss confirmed. No greeting, no territorial acknowledgement, no inquiry about the Krathian fleet's presence. The human commander had apparently noticed 12 warships transmitted the minimum required information and done nothing else whatsoever, as if Battle Group 17 were a minor administrative detail. Open a response channel, Korath said. The channel opened. UEF Vessel Resolute, Korath said, drawing himself upright in the way that 31 years of command had made automatic. This is Commander Draven Korath of the Krathian Imperial Fleet commanding the IS-5 Sovereign's Ruin and Battle Group 17. Your presence in this corridor has been noted. Please confirm the nature and duration of your current operations and acknowledge the proximity of Imperial Fleet vessels in adjacent space. He waited. Standard response time under treaty protocol was 30 seconds. At 45 seconds, Liss looked at him. At 60 seconds, Zarn's hands moved almost imperceptibly on his console. At 73 seconds, the channel opened from the other side. The voice was female. That was the first thing Korath registered, not the content of what she said, but the quality of how she said it. He had dealt with humans before briefly in border negotiations and treaty verification exchanges. They tended towards certain vocal patterns under pressure, elevated pitch, the tight efficiency of people trying to appear calm while operating at the edge of composure. This voice contained none of that. It was level in a way that had nothing to do with effort, the calm of deep water which implies depth rather than shallowness. Commander Korath, this is Commander Seraphine Voss of the United Earth Fleet. We are conducting authorized military exercises in designated neutral space as permitted under the Treaty of Galactic Concordance, Section 3, Subsection 8. Our operations will continue on current schedule. I trust you have a productive patrol. Voss out. The channel closed. Reich made a sound that was almost a word and wisely stopped it there. Korath looked at the display. His scales had moved into red not from rage but from something more uncomfortable than rage. The specific irritation of a man who had expected deference and received nothing at all. She hadn't greeted him, hadn't acknowledged Battle Group 17's tactical significance, had cited treaty subsections with the efficiency of someone reading a maintenance checklist and ended the communication before he could respond. She dismissed me, Korath said. The words came out quieter than he intended. Zarn studied his console. She complied with treaty communication requirements, Liss offered carefully. Technically, she provided full protocol response. Technically, Korath sat very still for a moment. Then he let the irritation settle into something more useful. Curiosity, analysis, the cold professional machinery that had carried him through 300 engagements without once allowing emotion to become a tactical liability. Where is the Resolute positioned, he asked. Liss checked. Stationary, Commander. It has not moved from its current position in 146 hours. 146 hours. 6 days and 2 hours. Sitting still while the other 16 vessels moved in inexplicable patterns around it. Korath looked at the Resolute's position on the display. Small vessel. UEF frigate class by registry. Though the sensor profile was slightly inconsistent with standard frigate specifications, a minor discrepancy in mass reading that could be explained by payload variation. Zarn, he said. Commander. Run the formation analysis again. Anchor the fixed point at the Resolute's position. Map every other vessel's movement relative to it. The display shifted. From this perspective, the chaos looked different. Not ordered, not obviously ordered, but different. The random movements of the other vessels mapped against the Resolute as a fixed anchor described a series of arcs and intervals that were still irregular, still defiant of conventional formation logic, but that seemed to be doing something specific with the space around it. Like hands, Korath thought, hands positioning around something that needed protecting. He stopped himself. Automated systems compensating for deficiency, he said, and this time the words felt less certain in his mouth than they had the first time. Yes, Commander, Zarn said in the same careful voice as before. 3 hours later, a priority transmission from Fleet Command ordered Battle Group 17 to advance to observation position Kilo 7, placing them at the inner edge of the neutral corridor. Standard procedure for a sector showing increased foreign military activity. Routine. Expected. Exactly what doctrine prescribed. Korath gave the order without hesitation. As the Sovereign's Ruin and her 11 escorts began to move, he watched the human ships on the display and expected them to respond some visible acknowledgement of his fleet's repositioning, some adjustment in response to the approach of 12 Krathian warships. They continued exactly as before. He found this more interesting than the alternative would have been. The room was small by any military standard. 9 monitors occupied 3 walls, their combined light casting pale blue across everything inside. No windows. The ventilation cycled with faint mechanical regularity. A half-finished cup of something hot sat at the edge of a console that held a real-time tactical overlay of Kepler-7's neutral corridor updated every 4 seconds. Commander Seraphine Voss was 52 years old. She had spent 23 of those years in United Earth Fleet service, the last 11 in the Office of Strategic Intelligence, where her job description had evolved through multiple classified amendments into something with no precise analog in standard military terminology. She was not an admiral in the conventional sense. She operated in the space between what fleets did and why they did it, a space that most military cultures underestimated until someone like her made them stop. She was sitting in a chair that had clearly been occupied for many consecutive hours when Lieutenant Cormac Webb entered with the update she had been expecting. Webb was 38 precise and had learned in his first week working for Voss that brevity was not optional. Day 6, Commander. Korath received the repositioning order 40 minutes ago, advancing to Kilo 7, exactly as projected. Voss did not look up. Time to optimal position. 14 minutes at current approach velocity. Formation Delta 4 on approach. He'll shift to Delta 7 once stationary. Yeah, she said. He will. She reached out and adjusted one of the monitor feeds, pulling the Krathian fleet's sensor profile to a larger window. She studied the spacing between the 12 vessels, the precise geometry of a military culture that had spent 4,000 years reducing warfare to science. She had spent 6 days watching that geometry. She understood it the way you understand something when you have seen it applied correctly 300 times and incorrectly 0 times. That was exactly the problem with it. The Harlow's position drift is Callaway compensating. Webb nodded. Manually. Stellar interference in Sector 9 running about 12% above model prediction. Nothing critical yet. Keep watching it. Understood. He moved to his console, then paused. Commander Korath attempted communication with you 3 hours ago. His tone was, I read the transcript. He seemed irritated, Voss said. That was the intended response. Webb went back to his console. Voss returned to the display. On the central monitor, 2 data layers ran simultaneously what Korath's sensors were showing him and what was actually present in the corridor. She looked at the second layer, the contacts Korath could not see. 12 vessels positioned with careful precision in electromagnetic shadows of debris fields and stellar interference zones running cold and silent for 6 days. 29 total, not 17. She had placed the first 12 in position on day 1 46 hours before Korath's battle group arrived. Days 2 and 3 complete mapping of his fleet's communication protocols, encryption, handshake patterns, the precise latency tolerances his systems use to distinguish real-time data from delayed transmission. Day 4 calibration. Day 5 practice. Day 6 was today. She had known Korath would advance on day 6 because she had spent 3 weeks before arriving in Kepler 7, reviewing every available record of his 300 engagements. She knew his decision patterns the way a chess player knows an opponent's preferred openings, not through particular insight into Korath as an individual, but through the accumulated logic of what 4,000 years of Krathian military doctrine produced in an officer who had never been given a reason to question it. That was the thing about perfect doctrine. It produced perfect predictability. He's in position, Webb said. 13 minutes, 47 seconds. She had estimated 14. Let him settle, she said. Don't adjust anything until he makes contact again. And when he does, 3 warnings, standard protocol language, treaty citations, complete professional compliance. A brief pause. And I'll close the channel before he can respond each time. Webb looked at his display. He won't like that? No, he won't. She picked up the half-finished cup and took a slow drink, eyes never leaving the tactical overlay. On the monitor showing Korath's sensor feed, the feed her systems were already positioned to intercept, and when the time came to replace, she could see his fleet in formation Delta 4 at the edge of the neutral corridor. 12 ships. Perfect geometry. She thought about what it must feel like to command a fleet like that, to have 300 victories behind you, and a doctrine that had never once failed to account for what an enemy would do. To look at 17 scattered human vessels and feel the comfortable certainty of a man who already knew how this ended. She set the cup down. Begin phase 1, she said, quietly. The first advisory went out at 1300 hours. Voss had written all 3 versions herself, not because Webb couldn't draft adequate language, but because the difference between adequate and precise mattered in ways that would only become apparent later when Korath reviewed every word of every exchange, looking for the moment he had missed something. She wanted him to find it. Eventually. That was part of the lesson. Commander Korath, you are entering a designated monitoring corridor under UEF jurisdictional authority. I recommend you hold position. 22 words. Treaty compliant. No threat. No elaboration. She closed the channel before he could respond. On her monitor, she watched his fleet maintain course. She had expected that. The second advisory came 4 minutes later as his formation began its transition toward the inner corridor boundary. Second advisory, Commander. Your formation has entered a pre-designated engagement zone under the Treaty of Galactic Concordance, Section 7, Subsection 3. This is a formal notice of boundary proximity. Closed. His fleet slowed marginally, then continued. Expected. In the pause between the second and third advisories, she checked the secondary display, the 12 dark vessels. All in position, patient and cold and invisible. They would remain exactly where they were for as long as she needed them. Korath's tactical officer just flagged the formation timing discrepancy, Webb said. Ran an analysis at Korath's request. Voss looked up. And Korath told him it was automated systems compensating for tactical deficiency. She was quiet for a moment. Did the tactical officer believe him? Webb studied the communication intercept. No, but he said yes. Voss nodded slowly. That was worth remembering. She keyed the third advisory. Third and final advisory, Commander Korath. You have 60 seconds to alter course before this interaction is formally logged under treaty violation protocols. One beat of silence. I trust you'll make the right decision. She closed the channel. On the main display, Korath's fleet crossed the inner marker at 51 seconds. At the edge of her peripheral vision, the Harlow's position feed showed the beginning of a drift. Sector 9 interference building. Not critical yet, she made a mental note. Communication intercept status, she asked. Clean, mirroring their internal network for 43 minutes. Latency holding at 0.031 seconds below their anomaly detection threshold. Weapons access? All 12 vessels tagged. Fire control access verified. Voss looked at the main display one final time. Korath's 12 ships in perfect geometric precision, 300 victories encoded in every angle. He's going to ask his tactical officer to run a worst-case analysis, she said. Sometime in the next 10 to 15 minutes, he'll say assume their formation is intentional. What does that mean for us? Webb looked at her. How can you know that? Because it's the question a good commander asks when he starts to feel uncertain and doesn't want to admit it yet. She turned back to her monitors. And Korath is a very good commander. The pale blue light from the 9 monitors filled the small room with its quiet, steady glow. Somewhere in the neutral quarter, the Sovereign's ruin continued its advance, its sensor arrays sweeping space that appeared by every measure available to it to be empty. Day 6 had begun, and in the Kepler 7 neutral zone, 29 human vessels, not 17, held their positions and waited for the lesson to continue. The formation shift to Delta 7 took 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Korath watched it happen with the satisfaction of a man watching a piece of machinery perform exactly as designed. 11 vessels repositioning around the Sovereign's ruin in geometric precision, each ship moving to its assigned coordinate without deviation, the whole maneuver unfolding like a mathematical proof arriving at its inevitable conclusion. The spacing between vessels created overlapping fields of fire covering 360 degrees simultaneously. Every angle calculated, every approach vector covered. Against anything in the assessed Tier 4 range, it was not a formation. It was a closing argument. Formation Delta 7 confirmed, Zarn reported. All escort vessels holding assigned coordinates. Sensor coverage at full operational capacity. Good, Korath studied the display. The human ships had responded to his fleet's repositioning in the way Tier 4 vessels typically responded to superior force by scattering. The carefully maintained pattern of the past 6 days had fragmented as he advanced ships moving away from his approach vector in what looked like the instinctive dispersal of prey registering a predator. 3 frigates had accelerated toward the far edge of the neutral corridor. 2 destroyers had reversed heading entirely. The cruiser designated UEF 774 had turned perpendicular to the plane of engagement, its trajectory carrying it slowly but unmistakably away from the confrontation. Defensive dispersal, Korath said, exactly as doctrine predicts for Tier 4 contact with superior force. It appears so, Commander Bazarn said. The 2 words sat in the air between them a fraction longer than they needed to. Korath looked at his tactical officer. Zarn's scales were neutral gray, professional, but his hands on the console were doing something subtle, slight variation in pressure, fractional tension in the tendons. The kind of physical tell that 31 years had taught Korath to read without looking directly at it. You want to say something, Korath said. I want to note an observation, Commander. Note it. The dispersal timing. Zarn brought up a secondary analysis window. Each vessel began its evasive maneuver at a different moment. The sequence spans approximately 11 seconds across all 16 ships. To an observer, this looks like individual vessels reacting independently, instinctive, decentralized, confirming the absence of unified command. Korath waited. But the sequence itself is ordered by vessel classification in a way that is statistically unlikely to occur by chance. Frigates, first destroyers, second cruisers, third. Within each classification group, the timing intervals are consistent to within a fraction of a second. Zarn paused. If I didn't know better, Commander, I would say the dispersal was choreographed. The bridge was quiet enough that the ambient hum of the ship's systems was briefly audible. Choreographed dispersal that creates the appearance of instinctive retreat, Korath said slowly. It's a possible interpretation. Korath looked back at the display. The human ships were still moving, still apparently scattering, still doing nothing that looked like tactical coordination. The Resolute sat unmoved at the far edge of the neutral quarter, exactly where it had been for 6 days and 14 hours. He thought about the microsecond timing. He thought about what Zarn had said regarding the formation synchronization before the advance. He thought about the Resolute sitting still while everything moved around it, like hands he had thought earlier, hands positioning around something that needed protecting. Continue monitoring, he said. Updated analysis every 10 minutes. If any pattern holds across 2 consecutive reports, I want to know immediately. Understood, Commander. The first anomaly Teba formally logged occurred at 13:47 hours. She had been running passive sensor analysis throughout the approach, her console cycling through standard frequency bands in the methodical sweep protocol that doctrine prescribed for contested zone operations. She processed data the way other people breathe continuously unconsciously, with the kind of sustained attention that didn't look like attention until something caught it. Commander, brief interference on long-range sensor array, duration 0.31 seconds. Frequency pattern inconsistent with standard stellar background for this system. Korath looked up. Source unknown. The signature doesn't match any cataloged natural phenomenon for Kepler-7. It also doesn't match any known technological emission profile in the Imperial database. She hesitated. It appeared and resolved before full characterization was possible. Korath filed this under the same category as the timing anomaly and the formation synchronization. The category was growing larger than he was comfortable with. Log it. If it recurs, I want immediate notification regardless of duration. Yes, Commander. 4 minutes later, Lyse looked up from her communications console with an expression Korath had learned to associate with data that was technically unimportant and practically significant. Commander, I'm seeing a minor discrepancy in our internal communication logs. Each word placed with care, the phrasing of someone who understood that what they were about to say could not be unsaid. The timestamps on our most recent internal transmission packets are showing a marginal inconsistency, approximately 0.031 seconds of variance. What does that variance indicate? It could indicate minor processing lag in our communication routing system that happens occasionally at high sensor load. Or it could indicate that our internal communication network is processing through an additional relay that isn't part of our standard architecture. She met his eyes steadily. But that would require external access to our encrypted communication protocols, which is not possible at Tier 4 technological capacity, Korath finished. Yes, Commander? He looked at her for a long moment. Her scales were carefully neutral. Her hands were steady. Both required effort, and the effort was visible in the slight set of her jaw. Increase internal monitoring frequency. Flag any further variance above 0.005 seconds for immediate review. Understood. Korath returned to the main display. He opened a direct channel to Zarn and spoke quietly enough that the words didn't carry to the rest of the bridge. Assume the human formation is intentional. Assume every vessel is exactly where its commander wants it to be. What does our current position look like? Zarn processed this for 3 seconds before he began working. The silence that followed lasted 94 seconds. When he looked up, his scales had gone completely white. Korath had seen that color once before during the Kalaran engagement 7 years ago, when a sensor miscalibration had nearly cost him the entire escort wing. Complete white was not ordinary fear. It was the color of a mind encountering a calculation whose result it had not believed possible until the numbers confirmed it. Commander Zarn said, his voice dropping below his normal register. If we assume hostile intent, if we assume coordinated action despite the apparent chaos. Korath waited. Every vessel in our fleet is currently isolated. Our formation appears intact, but the human positions create overlapping sensor blind spots between our escorts. Individual ships cannot provide mutual support without breaking formation geometry. He paused. And breaking formation would expose transition corridors to crossfire from vectors we're not monitoring because they appear empty. They're hiding ships, Korath said. The sensor interference could be consistent with active spatial manipulation, masking additional contacts. Zarn's voice had gone to something near a whisper. Commander, I don't think we're looking at 17 vessels. I think we're looking at whatever Commander Voss wants us to see. The Sovereign's Ruins Bridge maintained its practiced rhythm. Officers moved between stations. Consoles cycled through their sequences. Everything appeared to any outside observer exactly as it should. Korath sat very still in his command throne. Then the main display flickered. It lasted 0.8 seconds. The holographic projection dropped to static, recovered, and returned, showing everything exactly as before. Perfect geometry. Delta 7 intact. All 12 Krathian vessels in their assigned positions. System diagnostic, Korath said. Running, Teva answered. A pause. No fault detected, Commander. All systems nominal. He stared at the display. All systems nominal. 16 human vessels scattered in their meaningless pattern. The Resolute unmoved at the center. Advance to Delta 9, he said. Full encirclement formation. The order came out of him before he had fully decided to give it. Doctrine had generated it. The machinery of 300 victories running on the same logic it always ran on had looked at the variables and produced the response that 4,000 years of refinement said was correct. Encircle, press, force the decision. The Sovereign's ruin and her 11 escorts began to shift. Webb saw it at 14:02 hours. Commander, 2 notes higher than his usual pitch, which from Webb was the equivalent of another person shouting. The Harlow's position feed is drifting. Voss was at her console in 3 steps. The secondary monitor showed USS Harlow Registry AX-71 of the 12 dark vessels positioned in the sensor shadow of a debris field 700 kilometers spinward, and Harlow's positional feed was showing a 0.4-degree variance from assigned coordinates. Small, within acceptable tolerances. But the variance was trending increasing slowly and consistently toward an exposed corridor between 2 debris clusters. Voss did the geometry in 2 seconds. If Harlow continued drifting at the current rate for another 11 minutes, the vessel would clear the debris shadow. The gap in crossfire coverage on Korath's escort formation would widen by approximately 40% on the portside approach vector. Not enough to endanger the operation by itself. But Korath had just ordered Delta 9. His fleet was moving. When the formation completed the transition, the portside approach vector would become the primary crossfire corridor for 4 of her dark vessels. If that corridor had a gap in it, when the moment came, 4 ships would be firing from suboptimal angles, and the mathematical precision of what she had spent 6 days constructing would have a seam in it. 47 seconds before Harlow passed the critical threshold. Stellar interference in Sector 9, she asked. Running 12% above the predictive model, Webb said. Captain Calloway has been compensating manually. The drift started 18 minutes ago. 18 minutes. She had been watching the Harlow feed for 6 days and had not noticed an 18-minute drift because 18 minutes ago she had been monitoring Korath's formation transition and had allowed her attention to narrow. That was the thing about 6-day operations at constant cognitive load. Attention was a finite resource and she had spent some of hers in the wrong place. She had 42 seconds. Cormac, she said, and her voice came out 1 note above its usual flatness, barely perceptible, but Webb heard it and his head came up immediately. I need a complete recalculation of portside crossfire geometry. Assume Harlow is non-functional. 3-vessel solution only. 40 seconds. Webb's hands were already moving. Working. Voss stood at the center of her 9 monitors and did what she had been doing since she was 29 years old in an operational intelligence course that most of her cohort did not complete. She took a failing system and rebuilt the surrounding architecture around the failure in real time, keeping her hands still and her breathing even, her eyes moving across data with the steady discipline of someone who had done this enough times to know that panic was just wasted processing capacity. 30 seconds, she said. I see it, Webb said. Adjusting Nightfall and Corvus, their angles aren't ideal, but they cover the gap. I need to recheck the Resolute's arc. 20 seconds. Working, the number ticked down. She watched Harlow's position feed continue its slow drift toward the exposure threshold. She watched Korath's formation continue its transition to Delta 9. She watched the clock. Got it, Webb said. 3-vessel solution is viable. Portside coverage drops to 68% efficiency, but the quarter holds. Flagging adjusted coordinates to Nightfall and Corvus now. Send it. Sent. She stood still for a moment after. On the monitor, Harlow continued to drift. It would clear the debris shadow in approximately 9 minutes, fully exposed. But the crossfire corridor was already adjusted. The gap that had been opening was already filled. The operation was intact. She sat back down, picked up her cup, cold again. Good catch, she said. You caught it, Webb said. Barely. She set the cup down. Watch Sector 9. Above 15%, I want to know before it becomes a problem. Understood, Commander. She returned her attention to Korath's fleet. Delta 9 almost complete. 12 ships tightening their geometry, confident in their doctrine, completely unaware that the calculation they were certain of had been written for them 6 days ago by a woman in a room with 9 monitors and a cup that kept going cold. The transition to Delta 9 completed at 14:11 hours. Korath studied the encirclement. The geometry was clean. The overlapping fields of fire were comprehensive. If the human vessels attempted to break through, they would have to identify the weakest point, which was, as doctrine prescribed, a deliberately constructed deception leading any breakout attempt directly into concentrated fire from 3 angles simultaneously. Formation confirmed, Zarn reported. Delta 9 complete. All escort vessels holding assigned coordinates. What are the humans doing? Continuing their current pattern. No change in behavior. No attempt to identify egress vectors. Zarn paused. No attempt to identify the formation geometry at all, as far as I can determine. They haven't recognized the encirclement, Korath said. It would appear not. Reich, at his station near the rear of the bridge, was watching his console with the fixed attention of a young officer trying to appear fully occupied while processing something he couldn't quite name. The timestamp on his communication feed currently showed 0.031 seconds of variance from the internal ship clock. He had been watching it for 43 minutes. He had run the diagnostic 3 times. No fault detected. He looked at Korath. He looked at his console. He said nothing. The first complete crack in the picture appeared at 14:18 hours. Liss had been running continuous comparative analysis on the internal communication log since Korath ordered increased monitoring. Cross-referencing packet timestamps against the ship's primary chronometer, a process that would normally return a clean result in 4 minutes and was now 18 minutes later, still running because every time she reached the point in the log where the variance appeared, the variance was exactly the same number. Not approximately 0.031 seconds. Not a variable drift suggesting system load fluctuation. Exactly 0.031 seconds. Every single packet for 47 minutes. Commander, she said. Something in her voice made Korath look at her before she continued. I have been reviewing the internal communication log in detail, each word placed with precision. The 0.031 second timestamp variance I reported earlier is not a processing fluctuation. It is consistent across every communication packet logged in the past 47 minutes. The variance does not increase or decrease with system load. It does not vary with packet size or routing complexity. She stopped. What does that mean? Korath asked. It means the variance isn't being generated by our systems commander. It's being introduced externally by something processing our internal communications and returning them with a fixed delay. She held his gaze. Someone is reading our internal network and retransmitting what they want us to see. The bridge went completely still. Not the professional stillness of officers maintaining composure. The involuntary stillness of people whose minds have just processed a sentence that changes the meaning of everything around them. For 47 minutes, Korath said. Yes, Commander. Our internal communications, not external. Yes, Commander. Internal. Ship to ship within the battle group. Command traffic, tactical updates, sensor relay. She paused one final time. Formation data. Korath looked at the main display. Delta 9. Perfect geometry. All 12 vessels in their assigned positions exactly where they were supposed to be. 47 minutes during which everything they had been seeing might be what someone else had decided they should see. Teva, he said, verify escort positions through direct sensor contact, independent of the formation telemetry network. Teva worked for 60 seconds. When she looked up, her scales had gone to the pale gray that preceded white. Commander, direct sensor return from Escort 3 is inconsistent with its reported formation position by approximately 0.003 degrees of arc. She checked again. Escort 7 is similarly displaced by a comparable margin. Another check. All escorts are showing minor positional inconsistencies between their reported coordinates and direct sensor return. Minor, Korath said. The individual displacements are small, Commander. But they are all in the same directional sense, and if they have been accumulating over 47 minutes, she stopped and ran a calculation. When she finished, she did not look up from her console. If they have been accumulating, she said quietly, then the actual positions of our escort vessels differ from their reported positions by a margin sufficient to eliminate mutual support coverage between them. She looked up. Our formation is not intact, Commander. We are not in Delta 9. I don't know exactly where we are, but the geometry we believe we're holding is not the geometry that exists in actual space. Reich pressed his palms flat against his console and kept them there. Zarn sat very still. Liss looked at her hands. Korath stood. He crossed to the main display and stood in front of the perfect holographic image of 12 Krathian warships in precise geometric formation, an image that was at minimum a significant misrepresentation of reality and at maximum a complete fiction maintained by an external intelligence that had been inside his communication network for 47 minutes. Attempt to raise Escort 3 directly, he said. Emergency frequency. Bypass standard routing protocol entirely. List worked her console. The attempt took 30 seconds. No response, Commander. The channel appears open. There is no indication of a block or jam, but we are not receiving any return transmission. Either Escort 3's crew was incapacitated, or their response was being intercepted before reaching the Sovereign's ruin, or the Sovereign's ruin was in some way he could not yet fully characterize, not receiving what was being sent to it. Any of these three options required a technological capability that Tier 4 classification explicitly precluded. Zarn, he said, run the weapon systems check. Full diagnostic. Bypass the primary interface. Run directly from the backup relay. Zarn ran the check. It took 11 seconds. When the result came back, Zarn made a sound that Korath had never heard from a Krathian tactical officer on an active bridge. It was quiet and short, and it contained within it the specific quality of a certainty being destroyed. Offline, Zarn said. His voice had gone to something barely above a whisper. All primary weapon systems. Offline. Safety locks engaged. He looked at the diagnostic result as if looking at it long enough might change it. Commander, the locks were engaged remotely. He ran the secondary check. 32 minutes ago? 32 minutes. The bridge maintained its professional stillness. Officers sat at their stations. Consoles cycled through their displays. The Sovereign's ruin moved through space in what its own systems reported as perfect formation, order weapons ready, escorts in position, sensors clear. Every single one of those reports was a lie. Who authorized the lock? Korath asked. The authorization code is UEF standard format. I don't recognize the specific syntax. It didn't come through any channel I can identify in our system logs. Zarn's voice was flat with the specific flatness of a man who has followed an argument to its logical end and does not like where it arrived. It came through our own network, Commander, through the same access they've had for 47 minutes. The microsecond timing, the formation synchronization, the timestamp variance that Lice had flagged and he had filed and the diagnostic had cleared. 47 minutes. He looked at the Resolute on the display, still unmoved, still at the center of the neutral corridor, still exactly where Seraphine Voss had placed it 6 days ago when she had arrived in Kepler 7 and begun whatever this was. The communication channel opened before he could speak. Not at his request, not on a frequency he had selected. It opened because the other side had decided it was time. The holographic display shifted. The tactical overlay contracted and in its place appeared the image of a bridge, smaller than his stations, arranged in a more organic configuration that reflected a design philosophy entirely unlike Krathian military architecture. The lighting was warmer. The space had the quality of a room designed for function rather than authority. A woman sat in the center of it. She was 52 years old by human reckoning. Her face carried the quality of someone who had spent considerable time looking at difficult data and making difficult decisions marked by use, not by time. Her eyes were dark and held the steadiness of someone who had spent 6 days watching a thing unfold exactly as she had planned it. Behind her, visible through the bridge's interior transparency panels, were display screens showing tactical readouts that Korath recognized because they were the readouts of his own fleet, his actual fleet, in its actual positions in real time with complete precision. Commander Korath, she said. Her voice was exactly as it had been in the 3 advisories. Level, unhurried, extending no threat. I think we've reached the point where further misunderstanding would serve neither of us well. Korath stood very still. You've made 9 tactical decisions in the last 47 minutes, Voss continued. Every one of them was predicted before you arrived in this corridor. Every one of them was accommodated. She paused. You're operating under the assumption that you're pursuing prey. I need you to understand that you're not. Korath found his voice. It sounded more level than he had expected. Commander Voss, whatever you believe you've accomplished, check your weapon systems, she said. He already knew what the check would show. He looked at Zarn anyway because that was what command required. Zarn shook his head once. On the display behind Voss, the screen showed 12 Krathian vessels scattered across Kepler 7 in positions that bore no resemblance to the perfect Delta 9 geometry still displayed on his own main screen. The escorts were separated by distances that made mutual support impossible. The beautiful geometric proof that had taken 4 minutes and 12 seconds to construct was not what existed in actual space. What existed in actual space was 12 ships that did not know where each other were, with weapons disabled by remote authorization 32 minutes ago, receiving information curated by an external intelligence that had been speaking their own encryption back to them for 47 minutes. Voss looked at him with something in her expression that he had not expected and took him several seconds to identify. It was the sympathy of someone who has delivered a necessary truth and takes no pleasure in the delivery. "Commander," she said quietly, "I want to show you what actually happened. All of it. From the beginning." The replay lasted 11 minutes. Voss said almost nothing during it. She let the footage speak in the way that only undeniable evidence can speak, without argument, without interpretation, with the flat authority of recorded reality, refusing to negotiate with what a man had believed about himself for 31 years. Korath watched it all. He watched the first 12 dark vessels arrive in Kepler 7 6 days before his battle group, moving cold and silent through the electromagnetic shadow of a debris field that his fleet's long-range sensors had logged as empty space and dismissed. He watched them position themselves with mathematical precision at intervals that made no sense as a defensive formation and complete sense as something else entirely foreign. A net patient and invisible, woven through the geography of the neutral corridor before the first Krathian ship had arrived to be caught in it. He watched the next 6 days compressed into sequence. The systematic mapping of his fleet's communication protocols, the gradual introduction of latency measured in fractions of milliseconds, the careful calibration of fabricated telemetry that matched his system's expectations so precisely that the deception had no seams. He watched his own bridge reconstructed from intercept data and saw himself dismiss each anomaly as it surfaced: the timing synchronization, the sensor interference, the timestamp variance. Saw himself construct explanations that preserved his certainty and discard evidence that threatened it. He watched himself advance into Delta 9. He watched from an external perspective. His own sensors had never possessed what Delta 9 actually looked like in real space versus what it looked like on his display. The difference was not dramatic. That was almost worse. Each individual displacement was small. Each adjustment made to his escort's actual trajectories over 47 minutes was subtle enough that no inertial alarm had triggered. No crew member had felt anything unusual. No instrument had returned an anomalous reading. The accumulated effect was catastrophic. He watched his weapons go offline and his formation dissolve and his communications become a fiction maintained by external intelligence. And he watched all of this happen while the bridge of the Sovereign's ruin continued its practiced professional rhythm, officers moving between stations with the precision that 4,000 years of doctrine had made automatic. When the replay ended, the display returned to Voss. She waited. "How many vessels?" Korath said finally. "Actually, 29, Voss said, "not 17. You arrived 6 days ago. And we arrived 6 days ago. And the 12 that we couldn't see were in position before you received your patrol orders for this sector." She said it without emphasis, not gloating, stating a sequence. "We mapped your standard patrol routes before we placed the first vessel. The positioning was designed around where you would be, not where you were." Korath absorbed this. Around where you would be. Before he had known he would be here, they had already accounted for his presence. His 300 victories had made him predictable enough to plan around months in advance. "The communication intercept," he said. "You said you learned to speak our encryption. Our signals intelligence team spent 4 days on your protocol architecture before this operation began. Your encryption is excellent, Commander. It took considerable effort. But the underlying logic of any encryption system reflects the assumptions of the culture that designed it, and once you understand the assumptions, the specifics follow." She paused. "Your culture assumes that military communication networks will be accessed by adversaries attempting to block or jam transmissions. You have robust countermeasures against both. You don't have countermeasures against an adversary who learns the language and joins the conversation." Zarn made a small, involuntary sound that he immediately suppressed. Korath understood it. The idea was elegant in the way defeats are elegant when you see them clearly for the first time, not clever, not exotic. Simply the application of a perspective the defeated party had never considered, because questioning it had never seemed necessary. "They don't break the lock. They get a key." "The weapon systems," he said. "Your fire control architecture has 14 access points reachable through the communication network under the right conditions. Your security protocols are genuinely sophisticated. Our AI required approximately 4 hours to work through them." She said it without apology or pride. "We accessed them 47 minutes after we established full network integration and engaged the safety locks remotely at the moment your formation reached Delta 9. Because Delta 9 was the commitment," Korath said, "the point of no return. Yes, before Delta 9, you could have altered course without significant consequence. After Delta 9, any withdrawal exposes transition corridors. We wanted you fully committed before we secured your weapons because a commander who feels he can still maneuver is a commander who doesn't fully understand his position. The clinical precision of it settled over him. Every decision he had made had been anticipated. Every response he might have made had been accommodated. The operation had not been designed to defeat him. It had been designed to make him defeat himself using the tools he trusted most: his doctrine, his certainty, his 31 years of absolute conviction that he understood how battles worked. There is something else, Voss said. Something I want you to understand before we discuss what comes next. Korath waited. You asked your tactical officer 43 minutes into this engagement to run a worst-case analysis. You told him to assume the human formation was intentional and calculate the implications. She held his gaze. No other Krathian commander in this sector has been asked to respond to UEF operations in the past 6 months. We have run comparable operations against 3 other battle groups. In none of those cases did the commanding officer ask that question. The bridge was very quiet. They reacted to what they saw, Voss continued. They made decisions based on what their doctrine told them and never deviated from the framework. You did something different. You asked what it would mean if everything you were seeing was wrong. I didn't act on the answer, Korath said. The words came out with a flatness that contained something close to self-contempt. No, but you asked the question, and that matters more than you might currently believe. She leaned forward slightly, a small movement that changed the quality of her attention in a way that was difficult to define. We didn't choose you randomly, Commander Korath. Of the 14 Krathian officers in operational command positions within 3 sectors of this corridor, our analysis identified you as the officer most likely to understand what we needed to demonstrate. Not the most powerful, not the most decorated, the most likely to learn from it. Korath sat with that for a moment. You've been watching our officers, he said. We've been watching your fleet for considerably longer than 6 days. He thought about what that meant, what infrastructure that kind of watching required. He thought about a Tier 4 civilization that had deployed 29 vessels with complete sensor stealth and remote weapons access capability, and about what else a civilization like that might have deployed in places he had never thought to look. What do you want, he asked. What does this achieve for you? Right now, for you to withdraw with your fleet intact and your crew unaware of the specifics of what happened here. She said it simply. The treaty holds. No shots fired. Your escorts think they conducted a routine patrol and encountered human vessels exercising their treaty rights. They'll return to their stations with their confidence in their systems and their doctrine intact. Only you and your bridge officers know the full picture. And what do you get from that? A Krathian officer who understands what human military capability actually is, who will go back to his fleet command and tell them the truth. Not because we humiliated him into it, but because he's the kind of officer who understands that the truth is the only useful starting point. Korath looked at her for a long moment. And if I chose to fight anyway, he said, with backup systems, with whatever my technical crew might find that hasn't been compromised. Voss's expression didn't change, but something in it became briefly and absolutely clear. Then we would stop teaching, she said, and start winning. 3 seconds of silence. We withdraw, Korath said, with full honors as offered. Voss nodded once. Stand by. Restoring your systems now. The display shifted. The fabricated overlay dissolved, and in its place, for the first time with full precision, appeared the actual tactical picture of Kepler-7's neutral corridor. 12 Krathian vessels scattered across space in positions that bore no resemblance to the formation his display had been reporting for 47 minutes. 29 human ships emerging from sensor shadows with the unhurried certainty of things that had never needed to hide but had chosen to. The scale of it registered in stages. Liss exhaled sharply. Tiva sat very still and looked at her console as if meeting it for the first time. Reich took one slow breath and pressed both hands flat against his station and did not move them. Zarn stared at the display for 4 seconds, then turned to face forward and resumed his professional bearing with the discipline of someone choosing as an act of will not to be destroyed by what he was looking at. The communications channel opened. All escort vessels simultaneously requesting orders, their voices carrying the confusion of people who had been going about their work and had just been told without explanation that the context for all of it had changed. Signal the fleet, Korath said. All vessels withdraw to Sector 7. Maintain current headings until clear of the neutral zone. He looked at the display one final time. 29 human ships. The Resolute still at the center, still unmoved. Commander Korath, Voss said before he could close the channel. Her voice carried something it had not carried before. One sentence offered without protocol or tactical objective. That was the right call. The channel closed. The journey back took 4 hours and 16 minutes. Korath sat in his command throne for all of it, watching the neutral zone recede on the aft display, while his bridge crew worked in careful silence. They knew the broad shape of what had happened, the fabricated telemetry, the compromised weapons, the actual positions of their fleet versus the reported positions. But knowledge and comprehension are different things, and comprehension of this kind took time. Reich was the first to speak 90 minutes out from Kepler-7. He didn't address Korath directly. He was looking at his console, and when he spoke, it was in the tone of someone thinking aloud and not quite catching himself before the thought became words. If she's been watching our patrol routes long enough to position those ships before we arrived, he said, then she's been watching everything, every route, every formation, every... He stopped himself, looked at Korath. I'm sorry, Commander. I shouldn't have... You're not wrong, Korath said. Reich looked back at his console. His scales were pale gray, the early stages of a very large realization settling into permanent residence. Zarn, without turning, spoke to the forward display. How many other species, he said, not a question with an upward inflection, a question with weight. Korath said nothing because he didn't have an answer yet. But the same thought had been sitting in his chest like a stone since the moment the overlay had dissolved, and it was still sitting there 40 minutes later when Lysa's console signaled an incoming priority message cluster. She processed the first transmission, then the second, then stood from her station and turned to face Korath with an expression he would not have believed possible on a disciplined Krathian officer under normal circumstances. Commander, 6 simultaneous priority transmissions from independent sources. Zarathi Defense Command, Viscari Fleet Intelligence. 4 additional classified origins I can't immediately identify. She paused. All 6 are describing tactical engagements with UEEF forces. All 6 are describing the same outcome. The stone in Korath's chest became something heavier and more specific. Read me the Zarathi summary, he said. She read it. Compromised communication network. Fabricated sensor data. Remote weapons interdiction. Withdrawal under offer of honorable disengagement. The Viscari, the same, different specifics, same architecture. The others, the same, different sectors, different commanding officers, different dates, all within the past 72 hours. 6 engagements, 7 including Kepler-7, all conducted simultaneously within a window that could not be coincidental. 7 operations across 7 separate sectors involving 7 different species, all executed with the same methodology, all completing within hours of each other. She knew, Korath said. Commander Mao. When she told me the galaxy would learn of this, she knew exactly how, because she designed the learning. He looked at the communications data on Lysa's display. She didn't run one demonstration. She ran 7 simultaneously, and she timed them to resolve at the same moment so that we would all start comparing intelligence reports at the same time. She wanted us to find each other. She wanted us to sit with the collective weight of 7 separate failures all pointing in the same direction. The bridge was quiet. It's brilliant, Reich said softly, then seemed to decide he wasn't going to unsay it. Yes, Korath agreed, it is. Washington, D.C. Orbital Command occupied a station in high Earth orbit that had no equivalent in Krathian military architecture. Not because the Krathian Empire lacked the engineering capability, but because Krathian military design philosophy valued demonstration of power in its structures, scale geometry, the visible authority of a civilization that had been dominant for 4,000 years. The station above Earth was large, but its scale was functional rather than symbolic. It communicated nothing except that the people inside it were serious about their work. The briefing chamber on the highest level was circular walls of transparent composite, offering a view of Earth below, that Korath found despite himself difficult to look away from. He had seen the planet in intelligence files. Files did not capture what it looked like when you were close enough to see weather systems moving across its surface. 12 Krathian admirals sat in geometric precision around the central presentation space. Admiral Skarn, Supreme Commander of the Imperial Fleet, occupied the position directly across from Korath, 67 years old, scales in the controlled amber of a man who had been surprised very few times in his career and was managing the experience now with the tools 4 decades of command had given him. Korath told them everything. He told them about the timestamp variance, about Zarn's worst-case analysis and what it had shown, about the weapons lock and the fabricated telemetry and the 29 vessels that had been present since before his battle group received his patrol orders, about Voss's voice level, unhurried, extending no threat, and about the 11-minute replay that had shown him what 47 minutes of certainty actually looked like from the outside. He told them about the question. Skarn was quiet for a long time after Korath finished. His scales cycled through several colors in slow succession before settling into the measured gray of an officer who has received information that changes the parameters of every decision he will make for the foreseeable future, and is taking the time to fully accept that. You believe this was coordinated across all 7 engagements, Skarn said, not 7 independent operations that happened to occur simultaneously. Yes, Admiral. The methodology is identical across all 7 reports. The timing of resolution is synchronized to within a 4-hour window. The offer of honorable withdrawal was extended in all 7 cases using comparable language. Korath paused. This was one operation with 7 theaters, designed to produce one outcome, which is 7 species comparing intelligence reports and arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously. Not sequentially, which would allow each species to be managed separately. Simultaneously, so that the collective weight cannot be minimized or explained away by any individual government or fleet command. He looked around the chamber. She wanted us to find each other. She wanted us to sit with the evidence and realize all at once that we had all been in the same room without knowing it. Skarn studied him. You sound like you're describing something you admire. I'm describing something I understand, Korath said. Those are not the same thing. He looked at 12 admirals who had spent their careers in the absolute conviction that Krathian military superiority was an objective fact, a feature of the galaxy rather than a circumstance of it. What I believe, Admiral, is that we are being offered a choice, not between fighting and surrendering, but between adapting and being left behind by a galaxy that has just received a very clear demonstration of what it's dealing with. Skarn let that sit. If you faced Commander Voss again, he said, knowing everything you know now, what would you do differently? Korath had been waiting for this question. He had run through it on the journey back, constructing scenarios, imagining different approaches, different tactical responses. He had followed the logic carefully without flinching to a destination he did not find comfortable. Nothing, Admiral, he said. Silence. Explain, Skarn said. Any action I take is still generated by doctrine. Any adaptation I attempt is still adaptation within a framework she has already studied and mapped. She spent 6 days in Kepler 7 before I arrived. She spent months before that in preparation. Any new doctrine I develop would take years to implement across the fleet, and she would have mapped it before it was fully operational. He looked at Skarn directly. The only way to compete with Commander Voss is to stop being predictable. And a fleet built on 4,000 years of military culture cannot stop being predictable in any time frame that matters for the next engagement. One of the admirals, older her scales showing the deep amber of long institutional authority, leaned forward. You're recommending we acknowledge fundamental inferiority. Formally. I'm recommending we acknowledge a specific gap in a specific capability, Korath said. The gap between doctrine-based warfare and adaptive intelligence-driven warfare. That gap is real. It exists regardless of whether we acknowledge it. The only question is whether we close it honestly or discover it repeatedly in engagements we weren't prepared for. He paused. I'm also recommending we create a new classification for human military capability. Not Tier 4, not Tier 2, unknown capability, extreme caution. Because what we are dealing with does not fit the measurement systems we currently use. Skarn was quiet. I understand this report will reach the Emperor, Korath said. I understand what it implies for fleet doctrine, for strategic planning for 20 years of threat assessment. I understand what it does to careers, including mine. He looked around the chamber one final time. But 47 of our battle groups are currently operating on doctrine that Commander Voss has already mapped. All 47 can be run through the same engagement we experienced in Kepler 7. The only question is whether they experience it as an education or as a disaster. The chamber was silent. Skarn stood. Dismiss Commander Korath. I will relay your recommendations to the Emperor. He said nothing else. But his scales as he turned away had shifted from controlled amber into the complex cycling gradient of a mind that has accepted a large and unwelcome truth and has begun with the resilience of a man who has not reached that rank by stopping when data was uncomfortable to think about what to do next. The message arrived at 0340 hours, while Korath was in his quarters reading the technical analysis of his fleet's compromised systems for the 3rd time. 17 separate access points. 17 places where human code had inserted itself with such precision that 2 full days of active searching had been required to find them all. The transmission header showed UEF origin. Priority diplomatic. He opened it. She was in the same room. He recognized the monitors behind her without needing to count them. The lighting was the same pale blue, but her posture was different, less operational. The contained stillness of someone about to speak without a tactical objective for the first time. Commander Korath, Voss said, I'm aware that our engagement has created significant complications for you. That wasn't my intention, though I understand it was an inevitable consequence. She paused. I wanted you to know that your conduct throughout our engagement was exemplary. You faced a situation that no amount of conventional preparation could have equipped you for, and you made the decision that protected your crew rather than your position. She held the camera's eye with the same steadiness she brought to everything but without the professional distance. That's not a small thing, Commander. Whatever comes of the debriefing, whatever the institutional response to your report, that decision was right. Korath looked at her for a moment. Are you sending a message like this to the commanding officers of the other 6 engagements? No, she said. You're the only one who asked the right questions. He thought about that, about what it meant to be the only one who had asked a question that in retrospect seemed obvious, about what that said about the difference between asking and not asking. I have a question now, he said, off the record, commander to commander. Ask it. The tier classification, he said. You told me it measures what species choose to reveal, not what they actually possess. He held her gaze. Are you actually tier 4? Something changed in her expression. Not a smile exactly, something more complicated than a smile. The expression of someone who appreciates a question precisely because it cannot be answered. What do you think, she said. He considered this carefully. I think the tier system was designed by species who assumed technological development was linear and visible, who never modeled a civilization that would invest 2 centuries in deliberately appearing weaker than it is. He paused. I think humanity has been building infrastructure the galaxy cannot see, developing capabilities calibrated to be just beyond what anyone would think to look for. And I think the number that represents your actual tier is not a number you have any intention of telling me. Also astute, you're correct that I'm not going to tell you, because the uncertainty is the deterrent. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that was not quite in the register of the rest of the conversation, a tone shift so small he might have missed it if he had not spent 31 years learning to read the gap between what officers said and what they meant. Humanity almost didn't survive long enough to reach the stars, Commander. You know the broad outlines from intelligence files. What the files don't capture is what it felt like from the inside. She looked at the display surface for a moment before continuing, and in that brief pause, Korath saw something he had not expected. Not grief exactly, but the stillness of someone standing near the edge of a memory too large to fully enter. My grandmother was a naval officer during the resource wars. She survived the coastal floods of 2181. She used to say that the most dangerous thing a civilization can do is mistake its own continuity for a guarantee. Voss looked back at the camera. 2.3 billion people, Commander, in 11 years. And the species that came through it, they didn't survive because they were the strongest or the most doctrinally correct. They survived because they were willing to question every assumption they had made about how the world worked and rebuild from what actually remained. She paused. Every protocol in UEF military doctrine, every decision to warn before we act, every offer of honorable withdrawal, every operation designed to teach rather than destroy, it comes from people who watched 2.3 billion disappear and decided that if humanity ever reached the stars, it would not repeat what it had done to itself. We didn't come here to conquer, Commander. We came here because we learned at a cost we carry in every decision we make. What happens when a species stops taking its own survival seriously enough? A brief final pause. And we decided that no one else would make that lesson necessary for us again. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of something being understood properly for the first time. I think I understand, Korath said. Not completely, but more than I did yesterday. That's all we were trying to achieve. One final question, not tactical, personal. He chose the words with care. The officer whose ship drifted in the stellar interference. The 90 seconds. That was real. That wasn't staged for my benefit. Voss looked at him with the expression of someone deciding exactly how honest to be. The stellar interference in Sector 9 ran 12% above our predictive model, she said. The drift was real. The 90 seconds were real. He created a pause that carried more weight than the words around it. Good operations don't succeed because nothing goes wrong. They succeed because the people running them have trained for the moments when things go wrong and don't mistake contingency for failure. Were you afraid? She considered the question as if it genuinely deserved consideration. I was concerned, she said. There's a difference. Fear disrupts processing. Concern focuses it. He nodded slowly. Thank you, Commander, for the engagement, for the honesty. Thank you for the right question, she said, and for the right answer when it counted. The transmission ended. The priority message from Admiral Skarn arrived at 0410 hours. Promotion to Admiral, effective immediately. Assignment Director, Office of Adaptive Strategy, Imperial Fleet Command. Mandate develop doctrine for engaging with human military methodology on equal terms. Reporting directly to the Supreme Commander. He read it twice. Not censure, not investigation. Promotion and mandate. He read it a third time because the third reading was the one where he stopped looking for the condition attached to it and understood that there was none. The Empire had understood what he had tried to explain in the briefing chamber. Not that Krathian doctrine was worthless, it was not. It was 4,000 years of genuine accumulated excellence. But that excellence, calibrated only against known opponents, was incomplete. The gap between what they knew and what Voss represented was real, was not closing on its own, and required above everything else the courage of a commander who had been completely outmaneuvered and had chosen, rather than construct a narrative around it, to simply report what had happened. That kind of honesty apparently was rarer than 300 victories. He stood. He looked out the viewport at Earth below, at the orbital infrastructure that the intelligence files had underrepresented in ways he now understood were not accidental at the space around it, that appeared to any sensor system that had not been invited to see differently, exactly like any other inhabited system in the assessed galaxy. He thought about what Voss had said about her grandmother, about floods and wars and 2.3 billion people, and a species that had decided out of the specific wisdom that comes only from having nearly destroyed itself that no one outside it would ever need to make that lesson necessary for them again. He thought about what it meant to have been chosen. Not the weakest target, not the easiest lesson, the one most likely to understand. He had spent 31 years earning 300 victories, and none of those victories had taught him as much as 47 minutes of complete and undeniable defeat. The door to his quarters opened. Reich stood in the frame, 24 years old, pale gray, scales the seriousness of a young officer who has just understood something he will not forget. Sir, I heard about the promotion. Congratulations. Thank you, Ensign. Reich stood in the doorway. He had something else he wanted to say, visible in the slight forward lean of his posture, the hands that weren't entirely still. Ask it, Korath said. Reich looked at the viewport, at the planet, at the space around it that appeared empty and almost certainly was not. Do you think she's already watching the next one? He said. Whoever's coming after us. Whatever fleet from whatever species decides it wants to find out what humans actually are. He paused. Do you think she's already positioned 6 days in? Korath looked at the neutral zone, at the distant point in space where Kepler-7 lay invisible from this distance, where 29 vessels were continuing their patient operations in a corridor that appeared to any outside observer to contain 17 ships engaged in purposeless exercises. He thought about a woman in a small room with 9 monitors who had arrived in a sector 6 days before anyone knew she was coming, who had mapped everything before she moved a single piece, who had run 7 simultaneous operations across 7 sectors and timed them to resolve within hours of each other so that 7 species would compare notes at the same moment, and who had chosen when she had 12 Krathian warships without weapons and without coordination at her complete discretion to offer honorable withdrawal instead. He thought about the question she had left unanswered and the answer she had not needed to give. She never stopped, he said. Reich was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once with the gravity of someone filing something away in the part of his mind reserved for things that will shape the rest of his life. He left without another word. Korath stood at the viewport a while longer. The Office of Adaptive Strategy had no precedent in the Krathian Imperial Fleet. No doctrine to draw from, no historical model to base itself on, no record of previous engagements to analyze. 4,000 years of accumulated military certainty, and he was being asked to begin something that had no predecessor. He found to his own surprise that this did not feel like a burden. It felt like the first morning of something worth doing. Below Earth turned in its slow rotation patient in blue, and unreadable in the way that things are unreadable when they have decided exactly what they want you to see. And in the neutral zone at Kepler 7, in the pale blue light of a distant star, 29 vessels held their positions in formation patterns that looked to any sensor array that had not been invited to understand them, like nothing more than the random walk of leaves caught in a slow wind. Seraphine Voss was in her room with her 9 monitors and her cold cup of something that kept getting replaced, watching the next set of data from the next sector, where the next fleet from the next species had decided to find out what humanity was made of. She had been watching for 6 days already. She was 3 moves ahead. She had never stopped.